we are live. And that top of the hour breaks about as fast as one shake of the lamb, Sayles, Scott. Roger Sayles back sitting in for Joyce Riley, graciously invited me to guest host her wonderful program here to this wonderful large audience and give me an opportunity to get this information out. And I am thrilled to be here, and I hope you're thrilled listening to this. Some of you, if you're new, you won't be so thrilled. You may be a little depressed, but I guarantee you there's a light at the end of the tunnel, because now you got a way to get your sanity back. Let's get on to this timeline here as we start the third hour. This is the easiest way I've ever found to present this information, and we've got to go back a ways. We got to go back a ways and start back in the early 1800s. You know, with the founding of the country and the first central bank, that charter expired in 10 years. They were chomping at the bit to get their greedy little hands and proboscis back on the American people. There was a second bank of the United States, and that's the famous Andrew Jackson speech, "You're a den of vipers," etc. And he did not renew the charter. And that is important, because I believe at this point, I've come to believe that it was probably shortly after that the plan that is the one that we're living under today was formulated and started in the early 1800s. And I think if you study this and you look at all of the different ingredients that we're talking about, that you very well may come to the very, very same conclusion that I have, and that is now, for the very first time in my entire adult lifetime, an old boy from the South who's grown up with all of this stuff that's hung around for over 100 years in our culture and society. Now I know the real reason for the Civil War. And it wasn't to free the black man. What's the dialectic? Everything's dialectics. They tell us it was to free the black man. The Civil War was fought to enslave the white man. And I believe we've proven that. And that's where we'll start our timeline story, is in the early 1800s, around 1835 or 40 time frame rough is when I figure this started. It led up to the catastrophe called the Civil War, which we still live with today in our culture, unfortunately, and especially in our form of government. They had a little obstacle, though, and the obstacle was the existing 13th Amendment. Many people know about that. It's been found in more law books around the country, old law books, than you can shake a stick at. So obviously it was ratified, and obviously they had to get rid of it, because that talked about things like no titles of nobility could serve in Congress and stuff. And the titles of nobility and stuff is like lawyers and royalty, and they didn't want them up there. They passed a constitutional amendment, evidently got it ratified, although that's been pretty well scrubbed in history. They had to run in a new 13th Amendment. And the reason this is so important right here is because of the simplicity in the example that I'm going to give you. Because I have just recently come to the understanding that I can prove to you in the Constitution that they're running parallel governments. And that's what's happening. They set up a secondary government with the Civil War, and that government has run secondarily and subservient to the other one until they've hidden the original. Those are still there. And I believe this example will be startling to you. If you look at the new 13th Amendment, and it talks about involuntary servitude being outlawed, that is interesting because it makes voluntary servitude legal by omission. And it also uses the plural, their jurisdiction. We're going to pick up their jurisdiction right on the other side of this break. I know you'll be. Power up. Don't want to make any waste of any of this precious time that we've got together today, let me remind you, Roger Sayles sitting in for Joyce Riley, the Power Hour, by the way. Thank you, Joyce, very much. Let me remind you that the way that you access this cutting-edge information, and this is cutting-edge information right here, as all of Joyce's shows are, is by your support of the Power Mall, buying products and the offerings that they offer, the specials that they offer. Take advantage. Those things will be needed in the perilous and tumultuous days to come. Back to our Power Hour timeline here. How about that, Joyce? Back to our timeline here before the break, we were talking about the 13th Amendment and the verbiage in there. Keep in mind, an amendment to the Constitution is nothing to sneeze at. It's got to be passed in Congress, it's got to be put out to the states, and then passed exactly. Not a change of a jot, not a change of a tittle, not an I, not dotted, not a T, not crossed, not a word changed. Exactly how it was passed up there in Sodom and Gomorrah on the Potomac. And it has to be read 3 times before it's passed, and it has to be done, I believe, in 3/4 of the states that way. 2/3 or 3/4, one of the two. So when we read these amendments and analyze them, know that they have gone through that process, or at least the 13th did. The 14th probably didn't do as much, but the 13th is the one we're talking about right now. And it says that involuntary servitude is outlawed, leaving voluntary servitude legal by omission, except when duly convicted of a crime in any of the states or their, plural, their jurisdiction. In the next amendment, the 14th Amendment, it says any person born or naturalized in the United States, comma, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, singular, comma, is a citizen of the United States in the state wherein they reside. Keyword, resident, first time it's used in the Constitution in the first clause of the 14th. The important thing I'm trying to hammer home to you, the process that these amendments go through to become part of the Constitution. And since those two were ratified and passed and put into the Constitution about 150 or a little more years ago, they have been subjected to innumerable state and local and federal lawsuits. There are hundreds, if not more, lawsuits finding the validity of those two amendments. And yet, in analyzing those two amendments as we have, we see one is plural and one is singular. Parallel governments. What Roger found when I moved to Argentina in picking up the very first passport application that I had ever had in my hands in my entire life was the same parallel governments. And, in essence, the key to the matrix. Understanding the legal definitions imputed into these words, which have been misaligned dialectically to confuse you and everyone else, so this scam could be pulled off. And that is the essence of what's going on. So we go through the law to enslave, we go through the war to enslave the white man, the Civil War, and it instituted a secondary political status, because at that point, up to that point, blacks had been property. Now, it's very integral to understand the legal word property, because it's not the colloquial usage. Colloquially, we say, I'm talking to Scott here. Scott's our board operator. He's telling me everything's going okay and when to talk and when to shut up. And so I say, Scott, you got your car outside the studios up there in Minneapolis, St. Paul, whichever of them you're in, and when you go out and leave work, you go get in your property, your car, and drive home. Is that right? Scott's shaking his head yes. And that's the colloquial usage of that word. Legally, it's not that. Legally, the car, Scott, is a thing, and your property is a property right in and to the thing. So you got to not only understand the definitions of the words, you got to understand how they're being used legally, because they want you to use them colloquially. Say that 10 times. Colloquially. And be confused. In other words, they ask you that question, are you a resident? And you go, well, yeah, man, I live right over there. That's not what they're asking you. They're asking you, which body of law are you under to receive your benefits, and which body of law therewith do you owe your duties? You don't believe me? You don't have to go to a law library. Go to Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. How much more sophomoric can you get? And go to the word resident. You're going to see 2 definitions. The first one says, the act or fact of dwelling in a place for some time. That's the geographical definition. The second one says, the act or fact of living or dwelling in a place for some time, exactly the same verbiage, except for this, for the receipt of a benefit or the discharge of a duty. That's legal. Oshintas. Over on the radio ranch, we give Spanish lessons, because Lord knows you guys need to be learning a little Spanish up there. Oshintas is listeners. So Oshintas, this is important stuff here. So when they're asking you, are you a resident? Yeah, I live right over there. Yeah, no. Excuse me, sir. Are you imputing a geographical or are you imputing a legal definition to that term resident? You'll throw a bureaucrat for a loop with that one. Because they don't know. They just know they're supposed to ask the question. And then they just go on. You can tell them no, and they just go on. I've been through this. I got a Florida-issued state identification card presenting my affidavit as a non-resident, non-citizen of the United States. The lady that was the clerk scanned that 5-page affidavit in, asked me those questions. She said, are you a citizen? I said, no. She said, are you a resident? I said, no. She said, where do you live? She took the address. We got through the questions and answers. She scanned in all 5 pages of the affidavit and obviously attaching it to my profile in the computer. And then she said, that'll be $4, Mr. Sayles. Step over there and get your picture taken. You see, the laws are written correctly. We just don't understand them. We don't understand the basics of the law, and we sure don't understand the definitions that they've imputed into these key words to trick and deceive and enslave you. You know, it's the old thing. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can just enslave me. Get it? So we fought the battle to enslave the white man. They passed this 14th Amendment through hook and crook. If the southern states would not pass it, they put in carpetbaggers, they put in the new federal citizens, and they burned the law library. How about that? After that was ratified or not put into the books, now we had 2 statuses. We had the original status with God-given rights and constitutional protections, and we had the new federal citizen that was given civil rights from the federal government for their political status. Now, I ask you this rhetorical question. Do you think the old white men that were running the country 150 years ago took blacks off the plantation and gave them the exact same political status they enjoyed? If you do, you better find a big jar of pickles and go soak your head in the brine. Because that ain't what happened. And you know darn well that ain't what happened, and I don't care what color you are. After the Civil War, we had a 2-tier political status. I will prove that to you. The 14th Amendment was passed in the late 1860s through the 70s, the 80s, and on up to 94. We had separate but equal. Black drinking fountains, white drinking fountains, black restaurants, white restaurants, black railroad cars, white railroad cars. And that situation that had lasted over 3 decades came to a head at a case in the Supreme Court I've never heard anybody in the whole freedom movement mention before. The case is called Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy, exactly like it sounds. Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court confirmed separate but equal. Now the question I pose to you is this: how can black drinking fountains, white drinking fountains, black restrooms, white restrooms, black railroad cars, white railroad cars, how can that be equal? Well, it can't, can it? So, if that wasn't equal, what was equal? We got a ruling out of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, back when they used to issue real rulings based on real law. Because this corrupt Babylonian system wasn't in place back then. It was just being set up. So how were separate but equal? They both had a political status. The old one and the new one. Parallel governments. The 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. One is plural, one is singular. They're both in the Constitution. You don't even have to step foot in a law library or know one scintilla of law to understand that. I don't think. If you can't understand it, you might better listen to another program. I think our audience is sharper than that. All right. John 5, that means we're back. Roger Sayles sitting in. It's not the dulcimer tones of Joyce Riley, obviously. Joyce's old friend asked me to sit in, kind of ride saddle here on her program today, and I took this opportunity to do something I've been trying to do for 23 and a half years, is to get this information into an absolutely fabulous audience just like this one. So thank you, big guy, for the opportunity, and thank you, big gal, for the opportunity. I'd also like to, at this point, thank Cynthia and Catherine and Rose and for adopting me into the Power Hour family and all the emails and the stuff. And great. I am ecstatic to be here. Let's get back to our story. The Plessy versus Ferguson is where we entered into the commercial break. Plessy versus Ferguson is a very important case. How can separate be equal? They both had a political status, and that confirms that there's two separate statuses. It builds on top of the 13th being plural and the 14th being singular to further prove to you that they're running parallel governments, and that's what's happening this day today, the day before the traditional annual long Thanksgiving weekend. 2 years later at the Supreme Court, they had another case, very pivotal case, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark is obviously not black. Wong Kim Ark was Chinese. And that case was what they utilized to lay the superstructure for what's happening now, because now it wasn't just black and white. It was now Chinese, Mexicans, and everybody else. In fact, that U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark case, probably the most high-profile case ever decided by our Supreme Court on the issues of citizenship, denizenship, etc. I would illustrate that by remarking that that is the case that all the Obama birthers used. I don't know how many of them read past the affirmative decision, though, because in the dissenting opinion, which most people never read, there was a quote. It's on my website, auspassport4ed.com, the number 4. And there's a quote from, just one of the justices. He just happened to be kind of the sitting Chief Justice kind of guy. And his name was Chief Justice Fuller. And Chief Justice Fuller, in the dissenting opinion of this extremely important Supreme Court case decided, I believe, in 1896, only 2 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, and in the dissenting opinion, Chief Justice Fuller tells us exactly what's happening. The quote is on my website. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to paraphrase it for you. He talks about the allegiance of a liege man to a liege lord. That's feudal. That's the basis of the term we know as jurisdiction. And in the next paragraph, he says, basically, paraphrasing again, if the amendment, that would be the 14th Amendment, being studied under scrutiny in Wong Kim Ark, bears the construction now put upon it in the affirmative decision, it brought the English common law rule, that would be feudalism, into this country for the first time, just as England was being relieved of its inconvenience. The feudal era, 1,000 years of legal precedent in Europe and England. And if you don't think that's possible, if you're shaking your head, boy, this guy Joyce has got on here has lost his marbles. Let me draw you back to the Declaration of Independence. And in the latter part of that document, so eloquently written, I think probably the most important political document ever penned. So eloquently written by Thomas Jefferson. And in the back where he's got the offenses of the king, and one of, if not the very first one, he has brought in a foreign jurisdiction. What do we know about these guys? They do the same thing over and over and over again. They're predictable. It's their Achilles heel. They brought in a foreign jurisdiction before. They've brought in a foreign jurisdiction again. Chief Justice Fuller in Wong Kim Ark told you exactly what it was in the dissenting opinion. The common law English rule. The 14th Amendment brought the feudal system with 1,000 years legal precedent into the United States under the guise of the 14th Amendment for the very first time. And that's what you're living under today, you little voluntary serf. You just didn't know you volunteered, did you? To find out how in the last second. I know. Roger Sayles joined by the power.
We are America's largest independently owned communications network, GCN.
Okay. Scott tells me I'm live. That means we're back, and I don't want to waste a single second as we go into the final segment here. But first, before we get back to our timeline and our Supreme Court cases, let me remind you that you only have access to this information if you support the Power Hour, if you buy products through the Power Hour Mall, if you take advantage of the myriad of specials that Rosie has on special. I could tell you about water purifiers that are on special that you save $100 on. I could tell you about a heater you can save money on here, and boy, you got some polar vortexes circling around up there. You guys better pay attention to the heater. You got diets. You got my favorite, Dr. Sherry Rogers. It appears her whole deal is on sale. Her books, her E-Germ Elite, her cod liver oil, her powder that I can't pronounce. I bet she can. I can't. I won't butcher it. And the daily detox drink mix, that and a myriad of other things available. You guys get a hold of Rosie at the Power Mall. That number is, you probably know it by heart, but you're going to hear it again, 877-817-9829. Support the Power Hour. Roger Sayles sitting in for Joyce Riley. Gracious enough to ask me to host today and join y'all, and I took the opportunity to realize one of my life's major goals is to try and get this information out to an audience just like this one. So thrills, thank you, big guy. Plessy versus Ferguson, Wong Kim Ark, late 1800s we were talking about, set the stage. By the way, that Wong Kim Ark case, fairly important. All of the birth anchor babies come out of that case right there. Another repercussion of the 14th Amendment. We pass the 1800s, we get into the 1900s, of course, the early part of last century, World War I, the lead up, the great banking panic, obviously set up so that they could get the people scared, so that they could very, very surreptitiously sneak this Federal Reserve Act in on Christmas Eve of 1913. Set the stage. That was the second side of the Holy Grail. The first side was the 14th Amendment, where they laid the baseline to the Holy Grail trap. Let me try and give you just a little insight into this. You know, over at the radio ranch, when we're going to put the cows or the horses in the corral, we put them in a 4-sided pen there, and they're right there till we get back. But, you know, in Babylon, they were a little smarter. They only needed 3 sides to pin up their animals. And they didn't do it linearly, literally. They did it conceptually. And that's the Holy Grail, is a 3-sided conceptual trap that not only you're most likely not to get out of, you're not even going to understand it, because they stick it right in front of your face. It's on the back of your Babble Bucks, on the $1 ones. It's everywhere. They stick it in your face and surround it with mystery. It's a simple conceptual trap. The first line was the 14th Amendment. The second line was the Federal Reserve Act, which of course gave them control over the finances, which allowed them to further control the government, just like the great Louis T. McFadden says they control everything here in Washington later. That's out of the congressional record. I'm going to mute for a second and clear my throat. Thank you. The 13th Amendment, the 16th Amendment allowed them to come in and take control of the finances, which allowed them to take control of the government, prosecute their wars, World War I, in that era. Come out of World War I, set up the First Depression, which was evidently, the reason for that was to impoverish the banks that were not in the Federal Reserve System yet, and to also see if they could confiscate land. Many farmers lost their land. It was a short-lived depression because the president at the time, I want to say it was Coolidge, did the right things. They didn't have so much control over the presidency and the government at that point. They did the right things and brought themselves out of that instead of prolonging it, which happened 10 years later, of course. Then we went into the roaring 20s. Well, why were the 20s roaring? You know, flappers, bathtub gin, etc. Prohibition, Al Capone, Elliot Ness, etc., etc. Why were the 20s roaring? Well, the 20s were roaring because they turned on the credit tap. And all of a sudden, just like in the 90s, and just like they're trying to do again today, with QE to infinity, we had a lot of these Babble Bucks flopping around out there, and it gave people a false perception of affluency. And then everybody got into the stock market because everybody was making money in the stock market, man. I remember reading a case from, I think it was Jesse Livermore, the famous Wall Street investor, and he said, I went into the office today, I stopped by and got a shoe shine, and I got a stock tip from my shoe shine boy. I went back to the office and immediately sold everything I owned. He said, man, when you're getting tipped from a shoe shine boy, it's time to reevaluate your positions. So we went through 29 with the stock crash. We didn't get into the repercussions of that super seriously for a number of years. Now, the pivotal date that we're going to focus on is March the 9th of 1933. But before we get to March the 9th, let me jump forward just a little bit and read right out of the congressional record, reprinted in my book, From Sovereign to Serf Government by the Treachery and Deception of Words. Words from the grave of one of America's greatest spokesmen, that would be Congressman Louis T. McFadden. This was his speech. He was the head of the House Banking Committee, having been a former banker himself before entering politics. And let me give you this little factoid I read in studying McFadden. The last time that he ran for Congress, before they killed him on the fourth try, they poisoned him at a banquet at the Waldorf Astoria. Poison's one of their favorites, you know. The last time that Louis T. McFadden ran for president in his district in Pennsylvania, he was not for, as president for the House of Representatives and to hold on to his House banking chair seat. He was nominated in his district by the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Populist Party at the time. Have you ever heard of any of these Congress critters get nominated by all the parties? Kind of tells you the timber of this guy, okay? Fantastic statesman, no politician, Congressman Louis T. McFadden, speaking to you from the grave on March the 4th, 1933, straight out of the congressional record. Mr. Chairman, the United States is bankrupt. It's been bankrupted by the corrupt and dishonest Federal Reserve banks. It has repudiated its debt to its own citizens. Its chief foreign creditor is Great Britain, and a British bailiff has been at the White House, and British agents are in the United States Treasury making inventories and arranging terms of liquidation. In close cooperation with the British bailiff, a French bailiff has been standing by with a staff of experts and 25 of the leading French journalists. The United Front has arrived in Washington. Mr. Chairman, the Federal Reserve Board has offered to collect the British claims in full from the American public by trickery and corruption. Imagine that. If Great Britain will help it to conceal its crimes, the British are shielding their agents, the Federal Reserve System, because they do not wish that system of robbery destroyed here. They wish it to continue for their benefit by means of it. Great Britain has become the financial mistress of the world. Mistress. Mr. Chairman, I'm well aware that the international bankers who drive up to the door of the United States Treasury in their limousines look down with scorn upon members of Congress because we work for so little while they draw millions a year. The difference is that we earn or try to earn what we get. They steal the greater part of their takings. Congressman Louis T. McFadden, a former banker, worked his way up from dumping paper baskets to the president of the bank, got into politics, chaired the House Banking Committee for just about from when he got there in the early part of the century till he was murdered, knew what the banking scam was. Previous to that speech by a few days, on March the 9th of 1933, the United States was declared bankrupt, that McFadden alluded to there. So when you're bankrupt, you're bankrupt. Up to that point in time, the gold had backed our currency, and you could take a $20 gold certificate and take it to the bank and exchange it for a beautiful St. Gaudens coin. But when the United States was declared bankrupt, they went in and took the gold, didn't they? They said that the British and the French were there to liquidate. And up to that point, the gold had backed the certificates, what we call money. Actually, the gold's the money. The certificate was a representation of the money. But when they were declared bankrupt, they took all the gold, so that can no longer back the money. So in place of the gold, they placed, first of all the territories and possessions, and then all of the people as property. Remember our example, Scott, with your car. As property, the objects of someone's property right. Involuntary servitude that was legal by omission in the 13th Amendment. In this established system of law with 1,000 years of legal precedent, of which the person who volunteers into slavery is property. Don't believe that? Go to Black's Law Dictionary. Those people in the feudal era were called villains. It looks like villain, V-I-L-L-E-I-N, because it's a French derivative word, as the feudal system outgrew Rome and was established in Europe before William the Conqueror in 1066 at the behest of the Catholic Church brought it over and conquered England. So it appears to be villain. We pronounce it villain. If you'll go to a Black's Law Dictionary, there's a number of different types of villains listed there. The one that we're going to concentrate on here is called a villain regardant, just like it sounds, a villain regardant. And in Black's Law Dictionary, in the definition that sits there next to the villain regardant, it says, a villain attached to the land, property, and transferable by deed. A villain attached to the land and transferable by deed. Now, we found a smoking gun for this. It was alluded to in one of Congressman McFadden's speeches. And I went back, years before all of a sudden, man, I better go look at that. I go back and look, and it's a speech it's in the book, the quote's in the book, and it was given to the American Association of Colleges and Law Schools. And what really sticks out is that convention, the annual convention of American colleges and law school, that year that this speech was given, was held in Chicago. Do you know when they scheduled that convention for the all-important organization that oversees all the colleges and law schools in the country? December the 30th. How many people from the colleges and law schools do you think attended the New Year's Eve weekend convention in Chicago to hear the speech given by the legal counsel from the Department of Agriculture, very important, called Experimental Jurisprudence and the New Deal? I have the speech in its entirety. It will be in the follow-up book, From Sovereign to Serf. When I found that, I sent it to my friend Al Addis. Most of you probably know who Al is and his contributions he's made. Al wrote back to me, he said, that is the single most damning government document I have ever read. That was Al's comment. Experimental Jurisprudence and the New Deal. March the 9th of 1933, what happened? They took the gold which had previously backed the money. They now had the feudal system set up with the 13th Amendment making voluntary servitude legal by omission, the 14th Amendment with all of the Supreme Court cases, etc., and they just slipped that baby right in, putting the people in now as property from the feudal system that has been instituted, and that is what backs the bonds that back the world reserve currency. Because you see, when you've heard it, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, well, what does that mean? Does that mean if the merchant gets it and it's not good, he's going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah on the Potomac and exchange it? No. That means that if you buy the bonds that back the currency, that you'll get your bond coupon back. And what backs the bonds? Because, the root word of bondage is bond. So what backs the bond? Now, with the feudal system in place, the people being put in as voluntary serfs, which is legal by omission in the 13th Amendment, through birth certificates that was passed in the early part of the 20s. Now you, as property, back the bonds that are the full faith and credit that back the Babel bucks that are Federal Reserve notes. And what is the full faith and credit? The full faith and credit is that you'll pay your income taxes to the individuals representing Satan, and that they'll pay the bondholders, and now the full faith and credit of the United States is secure. How about that? So once that was done, then we had to start building up the administrative state, because now we've got all this property, and we have to have some way to regulate it or administrate it, don't we? That's when all the three-letter alphabet agencies started popping up, and all of the New Deal, Raw Deal, some people call it. And we went through the 30s. Roosevelt couldn't get that passed initially and had to go back through a treaty and get all that stuff passed. He had a lot of opposition from the Supreme Court, and they couldn't get any regulatory things through for the structure for the administrative agencies to follow, because they have a strict routine that they have to follow in administering or overseeing, if you will, the new property, the new little serfies. And so it was in 1946, after World War II, that the Administrative Procedures Act was passed. That's Title V, Section 552 and following. At SEG is the legal terminology, I believe. So we went through the 30s and we approached World War II. And in that confusion is when they like to do their little dirty work, because everybody's distracted. Don't forget psychopaths, which is what these people are, love to use in deflection. There's our last break. Scott's telling me we got to hear some messages. I'm going to... All right, we're going to jump right back in there and get this thing started, because we've got a limited amount of time here in this last little bit. We went up to 1940, and in 1940, and I thank Larry B. Kraft, the Huntsville Flash, for finding this, in the statutes at large, the real organic law of the United States, not the United States Code, they passed a piece of legislation called the Nationality Act of 1940, and right there is where they hid the salami, because they took our buddy Ferguson, you know, the opposite of Plessy, and they turned him away from the capital C citizen. They put a new label on him called a U.S. national right there. And in the very first line of it, it says, a citizen of the U.S. national is someone who is not a citizen of the United States, but still owes the United States full allegiance. There you go. There's our two. The plural from the 13th, the singular from the 14th. Plessy versus Ferguson, national versus federal citizenship. That's where they hid it, right at the start of World War II, the Nationality Act of 1940. That will be in the second book. They went on through the 40s, set up the Administrative Procedures Act to give the guidelines for the new administrative regulatory agencies, which were A, already there, B, the ones they were planning. We've only got over 250 of them now. 1951, through a Treasury order, they changed the old Bureau of Internal Revenue, the revenuers, the ones that go after the moonshiners, and they changed it into the individuals representing Satan. That's what I call it. It's the IRS. And that's where the IRS came into being. I believe it was in 1951. In 1954, 3 years later, we're going to bring the Supreme Court back in. They had an extremely important case now that the door had been closed with the Nationality Act, and that original status of Ferguson was hidden under this U.S. national label. Now we go back to the Supreme Court in a case out of Little Rock, I believe, called Brown versus Board of Education. And what was the decision in Brown? Nope. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. That doesn't apply anymore. Equal in the classroom, equal in the society. And that's when everybody was lowered into the secondary federal citizenship. Now, in knowing our enemy, what happened 2 months after Brown? The 1954 Internal Revenue Code was installed. And most of you that are citizens of the United States and residents live under that onerous burden to this day. So there's the timeline. You can follow it. It's not complicated. I hope you'll think about it over the long weekend. If you've got questions, we've eaten up 3 hours. I can't believe it. If you've got questions on this, you'd like to join us this afternoon, I have a program called The Radio Ranch. Roger Sayles, Radio Ranch. My co-host on Wednesdays is one notorious Tommy Two-Tone Schramm. We have a real good time. Both of us have a pretty good amount of knowledge. Both of us have been very successful in fighting the beast and winning. And if you have questions for any of this, I would invite you to listen in to our show if the net cooperates and lets us have one today. Only one interruption today, Scott. It's pretty good. So that's what's happening. That's where I am. I want to thank Joyce Riley from the bottom of my little old heart for giving me this opportunity. I want to thank you for joining us. Go have a nice weekend. Contemplate ahead. See you soon. Ciao.